No one will believe you." Judith's world was silent, but her screams were real. She wanted to run, to disappear, but then, "You're not alone." The truth had to come out before it was too late. Judith sat alone in the dimly lit room, her fingers clenched tightly around the edge of the wooden chair. The air felt heavy, suffocating. The walls, once familiar, now felt like they were closing in. She could hear the faint whispers of the past echoing in her mind. She wanted to scream, but her voice had long been stolen. Silence had become her prison, and fear was its warden. She glanced at the window. Outside, the world continued, as if nothing had changed. But inside her, everything was broken. Judith knew she couldn't hold it in forever. Something had to give. But when, and at what cost, the nightmares never stopped. Every night, Judith found herself trapped in the same haunting memory. Dark corridors, hushed voices, the feeling of being watched. She would wake up breathless, drenched in sweat. Her mother noticed the dark circles under her eyes. "Judith, are you okay?" she asked one morning. Judith forced a smile. "I'm fine." But they both knew she was lying. She had tried to forget. She had tried to move on. But the past had claws, and it refused to let go. Every shadow in the house reminded her of what she wanted to erase. But how do you fight something that lives inside you? Frank was the only one who noticed how much she had changed. He had known her since childhood. And this wasn't the Judith he remembered. She barely spoke. She barely ate. And her eyes, they held a sadness too heavy for someone so young. "Judith, talk to me," he pleaded one afternoon. But she turned away. "I can't." Frank didn't press her. He just sat beside her, offering silent support. Deep down, Judith wanted to tell him everything. But the words wouldn't come. If she spoke, the truth would become real. And if the truth was real, then so was the pain. The church was supposed to be a place of peace. But for Judith, it had become a place of fear. Every Sunday, she sat in the pews, forcing herself to breathe. Father Donald's voice rang through the air, preaching about salvation. But Judith knew the truth behind the facade. His eyes always found her in the crowd. His gaze burned into her skin. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear. But where could she go? No one would believe her. He was respected, admired, and she was just a girl drowning in silence. God sees everything, he had once told her. She prayed that God had seen enough. One night, Judith broke. She found Frank by the river, tears streaming down her face. "Help me," she whispered. Frank didn't hesitate. "Tell me what's wrong." But when she tried, the words got stuck. The memories choked her. All she could do was cry. Frank held her hands. "Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." His kindness cracked the walls she had built. For the first time, she considered the impossible, telling the truth. But could she? Would anyone believe her? And if they did, what would happen next? Judith couldn't sleep that night. Frank's words echoed in her mind. "What are you going to do?" She didn't know. She had no answers, only fear. The next morning, she avoided her mother's eyes, knowing that if she looked too long, she might break. Every movement, every glance felt like a burden she carried alone. The weight of her secret pressed down on her chest. Frank stayed close, watching her with worry. He wanted to help, but what could he do? What could anyone do? The church was a place of power, and Father Donald was untouchable. If Judith spoke, it would be her word against his. She felt trapped, drowning in the truth she couldn't tell. Every time she stepped outside, she feared people would somehow see the truth on her face. The guilt, the shame, it was suffocating. One evening, she sat by the river, staring at the water. What if I disappeared? The thought scared her, but it also felt like an escape. Frank found her there, his voice soft. "Judith, you're not alone." But she felt alone, more alone than she had ever been. Judith's mother had always been observant. It didn't take long for her to notice the changes. Judith's pale face, her silence, her avoidance of food. "Judith, are you sick?" she asked one morning. Judith shook her head quickly, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Mama," but her mother wasn't convinced. Days passed, and the questions only grew. "You don't eat like you used to. You don't sleep. Tell me the truth, Judith." The pressure was unbearable. She wanted to tell her, but how could she? How could she say the words without breaking into pieces? So she said nothing, but silence had its own consequences. One night, Judith's mother entered her room unexpectedly and found her curled up in bed, crying. She sat down, stroking Judith's hair. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." Judith opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wished she could disappear, but secrets had a way of unraveling, and she knew she couldn't hide forever. Judith couldn't avoid it any longer. She had to do something. But what? Frank wanted her to fight. Her mother wanted answers. And Father Donald? He wanted silence. "I can't live like this," she whispered to herself. She thought about running away, disappearing, starting over where no one knew her. But that wouldn't change the truth growing inside her. She placed a trembling hand on her stomach. "A life I didn't ask for." Tears burned her eyes. But no matter how much she wished it away, it was there, real. That night, she sat down with Frank. "I need help," she admitted. "I don't know what to do." Frank squeezed her hand. "We'll figure it out." But Judith wasn't sure anything could be figured out. The road ahead felt impossible. Yet for the first time, she had made a choice. She wouldn't stay silent forever. The next Sunday, Judith walked into the church, her heart pounding. Father Donald was there, smiling, preaching, acting like nothing had happened. But she saw the truth behind his mask, and she wasn't going to be silent anymore. After the service, she waited outside. When Father Donald saw her, he hesitated. "Judith," he greeted, his voice cautious. She looked him in the eye. "We need to talk." His expression darkened, but he nodded, leading her into his office. For the first time, she wasn't afraid. "I know what you did to me, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." He paled. "Judith, please, let's not do this." But she stood her ground. "You took everything from me, but I won't let you take my voice." That night, Judith told her mother and Frank everything. There were tears, anger, pain. But for the first time, she felt heard. "You're not alone," her mother whispered. And for the first time, Judith believed it. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she was done being silent.